Okay, and now we're coming to today's lecture titled Caught in the Web, Navigating Challenges in Digitizing the Arachnid and Myriapod Collections. The lecture will be given by Dr. Jason Dunlop. He's the curator of the Arachnida and Myriapoda collections at the Museum für Naturkunde since 1997. And he will share today his expertise with us on the digitization process of these collections.
Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me to give this presentation. As I say, I've been curator here for a number of years now. I just wanted to, I guess every collection is different. So what I'm not going to do is sort of tell you how you must digitize a collection. What I really want to do is more just explain what we have been doing, what's worked well, and what's perhaps not been, where problems have come up and what maybe you can do about those. Just to give you an overview of our collection, we'll say we're at the Natural History Museum in Berlin. Typical for a large European collection, we're a very old collection. Material goes back to the beginnings of the 1800s and the 19th century. It's a very international collection. There's material from local German material, of course, but also from throughout the world. And it is really quite a large collection. Across all of the groups, we have nearly 70,000 lots. And of course, a lot is not just one specimen. This can be a number of specimens. This is how many ID numbers we've been able to give to this material. And about 50,000 of those are for the arachnids, nearly 16,000 are for the myriapods, and about 700 are for the sea spiders. And that's based on our three basic collection books. And from all these three groups, we have at least 5,000 type series, mostly in the arachnids, but also a very important type collection of myriapods as well. Okay, and I guess when you're going to start digitizing a collection, one of the first things you're going to be faced with is what are you primarily trying to do? Are you going down the line of producing images, pretty pictures, or are you going to go down more the line of getting good, high quality metadata? And I think to answer that, in some ways you need to think about who are your end users? Why are you doing this digitization, and what do your end users need? Are you doing this for internal collection management? Is it to make data available to external users who want to know what's in your collection? Are you trying to produce images which can be used for museum websites, or that people can then look at images and not have to borrow specimens and examine them and risk them being posted? So these are important questions, I think, at the start of any digitization process. We felt that having lots and lots of pictures of brown spiders maybe isn't especially useful. So we've gone more down the metadata route. So we're trying to make sure we've got a good data for what's actually here in the collection, and hopefully later we can start to link this into to image data as well. That will be the long-term goal. A second question, perhaps from the start, is to think about, do you want to take your data directly from the specimen labels? Are you literally going to pull all your specimens off the shelf and examine the labels and take the data from there? Or have you got card catalogs or written catalogs that you can use as your starting point? And in the case of the Berlin collection, we did actually have fairly comprehensive catalogues and card catalogues, and we were able to use that as the basis for our digitization process. And at this point, I would have to say a big thank you to my predecessors as curators here in the museum, especially Manfred Moritz, my immediate predecessor, who was very hardworking and wrote really, really good catalogue books, assigned many specimens. Almost all the specimens got a unique ID number. We call it the ZMB number for Zoologisches Museum Berlin. And this gave us a really good, strong starting point. So we had very, very good analog written data as a starting point for the digitization process. The second big thank you goes to my collection manager, Anja Friedrichs, who some of you may know, and also now her team of volunteers. And she was really the person who did most of the initial transcription work. So she took the catalogue books from my predecessor and basically copied this raw data into an electronic format, in this case, an Excel table. And this gives us a really good starting point for actually having the data in a digital format that we can start to do things with. And the question is, what do we do? What do we do? We start with the raw data. This is the first page of our first Arachnid catalog book, and we turn it into the Excel table. And where I come in, and this goes a little bit back to the COVID time when we were all stuck at home. What should I do with my time? I thought, well, let's take this data and start to actually try and correct and standardize it. And this turns out to be really quite a challenging process. And I think this is what I want to talk about mostly in my lecture today, how we go about doing this, because the raw data is, of course, a very, very important step. But to make it useful for external users, there does need to be quite a lot of effort put into making sure this data is all in like a standard format, and that things like species names are as correct as possible. And I want to emphasize that this is not always an easy, simple process. Okay, so what happened was my colleague Marika Peterson, who's now our head of collections here, basically gave me a giant spreadsheet to say, okay, fill that in as best as you can. So all this goes everything from the minimum information, just to say we've got a specimen with this number, the verbatim information, what's written on the labels, to try and correct the taxonomy, is it a type, and then so on and so forth. You kind of see here that the left side of the table is more complete than the right side of the table. So the idea is to try and get this data as correct as or as detailed as possible. But this does actually introduce an interesting question. What is digitization? What do we mean? How complete should this data be before you can really sit back and say, yes, we have digitized our collection? And I'm not sure what the answer is, but that's something that we perhaps need to think about as museum curators and museum collection managers. What are you actually trying to do? How detailed do you want your records to be? Ideally, of course, everything would be filled in, but I'm not sure how feasible that is in all these cases. Okay, and of course, the goal is to transfer this eventually into a database. And here I have to thank my colleague Stephanie, who actually wrote us a really nice temporary database, just so we can get that information into a kind of usable format that we can search quickly and easily. The long-term goal is to use a proper official database like Specify, but we're having some issues about transferring what we have into the fields that are in that database. So this is our kind of interim solution, that it's just a simple database where everything now comes into a nice form that we can visualize. And if we're interested in a particular animal, we can simply search for that and pull up, as I'm sure you know from databases, a nice database record. And so I just want to take this one as a kind of example for what we're trying to focus on in the last few years. Because I think in terms of having a collection database, I think we're really looking in the first instance for three main things. What is it? Where does it come from? And who collected it? So here's our example, a wolf spider collected in Papua New Guinea by Friedrich Dahl. Okay, the what is it is obviously very important for taxonomy and systematics. That's probably what most people, our colleagues in the zoological community, are most interested in. They want to know what species we have here in the collection, whether they're the types of that species, and then just give an idea of what taxonomic data is here available. The where it's from is obviously more important for questions of biogeography and distribution. Give an idea of perhaps the museum has information that isn't in the literature, that we have distribution data that hasn't been published yet, and that's kind of interesting use for databases like this. And the who collected it is where we start coming more into cultural history. Why were particular people active in particular regions of the world at that particular time? For example, Papua New Guinea in the 19th century was actually a German colony. And so this is an explanation for why Friedrich Dahl was sent there to do some important collecting work. Okay, I want to start with the what is it. As I say, this is a wolf spider. And for those of you who are not working on spiders, we're extremely fortunate in the spider community that we have something called the World Spider Catalogue, which is a complete online, freely available database of all spider names that have ever been published up till now. And so we can simply, if we want to check, is that the correct name? We can simply type that name into the spider catalog database, and it pulls out the answer and says, yes, this is the right name. It's published by Dahl in 1908, and it belongs in the family Lycosidae, or the wolf spiders. And that's great. We can go a little further here. The World Spider Catalogue will offer you then the full systematic information, synonymy list, who's worked on this particular species. And here I have to have another big thank you to Anya. When Anya started in the museum, her first job was actually working on the so-called GBIF project, where we focused on getting all of our type data, so all the holotypes, syntypes, getting all of that information into a database format. And what we were able to do is then actually provide that data to the World Spider Catalogue so that they can include that in their information here. And so you can see here, for this species, we have a nice information that the syntypes are deposited here in Berlin. And that's obviously helpful to people interested in these spiders to say, okay, I know to contact Berlin if I want to see that material. The other one I want to highlight here is the so-called life science identification number. And several colleagues have said, you really need to include these in your database as well. And what this is, if you're not familiar with these, is these are unique numbers which are associated just with this particular species. And that, I think, is important for, as it were, future-proofing the collection. As I'm sure people in working with zoology know, if you go back, particularly with old names, particular species may have been called different names in the past. This is just as an example, the common wasp spider in Germany, and this has been called all sorts of things since it was discovered in 1770. And several of these names may appear in our original catalogue data. And of course, what we want to do is be able to link all of those names to that unique ID number. So even if in future the genus name changes, or even the family may change, we can still track that species down by having its unique number. So I think it's perhaps useful and helpful to include these unique species identification numbers in your database. A problem, though, that we discovered is which number. It turns out that lots of people have had the same idea, and so lots of different registries and websites and databases have said, hey, that's a great idea, we're going to give all these species a unique number. And so again, here's our wasp spider, and there's at least 7 or 8 different numbers that we could use. And of course, we have to decide then, do we use all of them, or do we choose one of them? Theoretically, if you've got one number, you could link it into all the other ones, but this ends up making your database rather large and clumsy. If you have to search all of these numbers and put them all in manually, this is kind of hard work and not the sort of thing I really want to be doing. So, I mean, in the spider community, most spider workers use the spider catalogue, and so we would focus on having the ID number from the World Spider Catalogue. But we have to think, if you wanted to link in your European data to something like Fauna Europaea, maybe it's worth having the Fauna Europaea unique number, which would help systems link that data more easily into that particular website. So again, this is something to think about. Which ID numbers are going to be most useful, and how do you want to include them? Okay, I mean, this was just the spiders. For other groups, we have other similar systems. For millipedes, we have a very nice Millibase catalogue, which does more or less the same thing. Anyone working with marine animals must know the worms database, also very good. This is good for our sea spiders. And for non-spider groups, I've tended to focus on the GBIF website, which also seems to be a pretty good source of taxonomic data. It seems to be fairly accurate and updated. There are some names that aren't in there, and this can cause problems, but generally those would be our primary sources of taxonomic information. Okay, but of course there are challenges, and one of the most obvious ones is spelling mistakes and legibility. We're dealing with material which comes from old handwritten labels, and sometimes it's not always obvious what was written on that label. So maybe this says for nutria, I'm not sure. And the problem is, if you're a experienced spider worker, you would probably guess pretty quickly, well, actually, this is a well-known genus of wandering spider, which is actually called Phonutria. The reason this is important is because in something like the World Spider Catalogue, some databases require an exact match. If you spell it wrong, you won't find it, and that's a problem. You have to either guess what it might be, and this is very time consuming if you're not familiar with this animal group. If you get the name right, if we know it's Phonutria, we can find the species we're looking for fairly quickly. And so that sort of speeds up the whole process. But this is a general problem of legibility. And then even the best people, the most experienced people in doing this transcription work will sometimes make mistakes, will sometimes not be able to read a poorly written handwritten label. And so these problems will continue to be an issue for your databasing process. Now, some databases are a little bit better, like this is the one we use for Harvestman, and it takes what we call a fuzzy logic approach, in that if something's not spelt exactly right, it will still try and find the nearest match. So here I deliberately misspelt the name of this Harvestman, and it's managed to give me what I think is the correct answer. So this one is okay, but the spider one, you would have to actually get it right in the first place. Now, this does then bring into another question. Who's actually going to do all this work? Who's checking the data? Who's making sure it's all correct? Just here as an example, the raw data for a nice crab spider from Java. Somebody spelt it wrong. I don't know who, but someone got it wrong. Now, someone then has to go in, me in this case, go into that data list, note that it's been spelt incorrectly, then in the identification column, put in what I now think is the correct name, and then check in the spider database, is that still the valid name? And no, it isn't, it's a synonym of something else. And the point is, there's a whole series of steps that have to be done, and you kind of have to get it right if you don't want to have lots of mistakes in your final database that you export into something like Specify. So there's a whole series of steps. Now, in an ideal world, you end up with something like this. Here's some scorpions from our collection, where everything is hopefully now under its correct current name. They're all marked here in green as the accepted name. We've also marked here names that are problematic, that they're junior synonyms or they're maybe nomen dubia. So we now have a pretty good overview of all of those species and their current taxonomic status. That's great. But if I'm going to make a critical comment, if you want expert medical or legal advice, you go to a highly trained doctor or lawyer. If you want expert zoological advice, you really need to go to a zoologist. And I don't want to sound arrogant here, but this process of turning sometimes poorly written label data into high quality taxonomic data is really, really challenging, even for someone who's quite experienced with this animal group or with the rules of zoological nomenclature. And what sometimes annoys me is you kind of hear sometimes, oh, databasing is easy, we'll just grab a couple of students, they'll do it all for us. For the transcription, that's okay. But for this correction work, you really do need, I think, qualified people in there doing that. Just to give you an idea, correcting about 50,000 arachnid entries has taken me about a year, devoting around half of my time, working time, to doing that. And what worries me a little bit is that museum curators seem to be something of an endangered species. I mean, you see this not only in our museum, but in other museums as well, that the traditional curators are not being replaced when they retire, but we were always that bridge between collection management and the academic world of kind of knowing the animal groups and knowing the taxonomy and being in an ideal position to do this kind of correction work. So this, I think, is something that perhaps people running museums also need to consider. Okay, another challenge that comes up is unpublished names. These are a real nuisance. I hate these. They can be on the jar labels, they can also be in the catalogue books, and we have to be a little bit careful not to accidentally include them in published lists of data, because then you make that taxonomic name available. It becomes your name if you published it. And we want to try and identify those and keep them, at least mark them in the databases as unpublished names so that somebody doesn't accidentally use them. Now, another thing you start to hear now is people say, you know, this kind of thing, it's no problem. In the future, AI is going to do everything for us. So artificial intelligence is the solution. In a few years' time, we can just put anything in there and it'll solve all our problems. Just as a bit of fun, I put this name, Aranæus barchi, which has never been published. Its name does not exist. I ran that through ChatGPT, and it tells me that it's a known species of orb-weaving spider, which is wrong. And the problem, I think, is I'm kind of interested in this, so I was looking into this. These large language models that go behind AI, the way they're written at the moment, they try and always give you an answer, even if it's wrong. And this is a little bit dangerous if we're going to start relying on those for correcting collection data, because they're going to be tending to try and give you an answer, even if they really don't know. So it doesn't know this name, but it thinks it could be a real species, and so it tells you it is a real species. And we want to try and avoid these hallucinations coming into our databases. So I'm sure artificial intelligence will become an extremely important tool to be used in the future, but we have to be a little bit careful about using it at the moment. And also, if you're bringing people in from outside to do your databasing, you need to tell them what are reliable sources of taxonomic data, and not to just rely too much on sources that are perhaps going to give you the wrong answer. Another challenge, lost specimens. And this is where I have to be a little critical of our own approach. One disadvantage of taking the data straight from the catalogues, as opposed to going to the specimens and their labels, is that you might discover the specimen isn't there anymore. Somebody asked me recently for this species described in from Sri Lanka, and according to our catalogue, it should be there, but it isn't. It must have been lost probably in the 19th century. And so I think a final but time-consuming step that has to be done at some point, if you're going to start with catalogue books, is you then actually at some point have to go to the physical collection and check what's actually there. Is the data in the catalogue book correct compared to what's actually in the jars? Sometimes you find there are less species, males have been identified as females, and so on. So all these problems sometimes turn up. And we're actually using student assistants for this. So thanks you to Fenya and Gerrit, who've been doing this recently for us. And their job is simply to take the specimens off the shelves and just check that what's in the database is matching what's actually on the physical label and then the physical specimens and what condition the specimens are in. So that's an important step that I think still has to be done. Okay, and again, a critical comment. What we're kind of finding is that the metadata is actually becoming better than the physical collection. In recent years, at least 11 new spider families have been proposed, and I don't really want to go into the collection every week and have to reorder things and check everything's in the right family names and reprint labels and so on. This is time consuming, and it's a question of how often do you want to do that. And in some ways it's easier to just quickly change a record in the Excel table than it is to physically move specimens around and print out new labels for them. So this is something we have to be aware of, at least within our own collection management. How often do we want to actually go in there and physically update the collection so that it's matching exactly what's in the database? Okay, let's move on to the next section. Where's it from? Just as an example, we're going to go with Friedrich Dahl. Again, he was one of my predecessors. He was a former curator here in Berlin, and he was very active in New Guinea and collected here from a place called Kabakul in a swampy forest. Now, we were encouraged by Mareike to use as a source of geographical data the website GeoNames, and I think this is a very good resource. There's the link to it, and it's a gazetteer. It's a database of geographical names, not just towns and cities and countries, but also individual places. And we find this really quite useful and fairly straightforward. You simply put the name into your database. It shows you if you can find it. So here we've got it either as a bay or as a populated place. We probably want the populated place. Click on that, and it then gives you the basic data about that. And what's very nice is it gives you firstly a unique ID number, which you could also put into your database. So again, like we were doing with the species, you could have your localities associated with a unique number. And of course, it gives us the coordinates, geographical coordinates. And thanks to the magic of Google Maps these days, it's very simple to simply Google those coordinates and it will take you fairly easily to the correct place. So we've now found hopefully the correct locality, and that's great. And you can put the coordinates in your database. Now, what's also, if you've got the time and effort and you want to, you can go a little bit further. If you go to something like Google Earth, it's got a measuring tool. And what you can do here, for example, is try and get an idea of how big this place was. It appears to be a fairly small kind of village and maybe has a radius of about 1 kilometre. So we're dealing with a fairly small place. And what's nice about that is you can go further if you want to. You don't have to, but it's perhaps an interesting way to go forward. And there are things like these georeferencing calculators. And this is the one we've been using. And what you can do is put your uncertainty into that calculator as well as the coordinates, and it will calculate, as it were, an uncertainty radius. And what that means is there's a very high chance that that specimen was collected somewhere within this radius. So the larger the place, the larger the radius. If you did it for Berlin, of course, it wouldn't be 1 kilometre, it would be several kilometres. And there would be a much larger area. But hopefully what we can say is that that specimen collected in a swampy forest probably came from somewhere within that red circle. So that gives us a kind of a border for where that specimen is likely to have been collected. So if you want to, you can not only put the locality in there, you can also put in uncertainty estimates as well. But it is quite a time-consuming process because you're having to look for each individual locality in Google Maps and then do this calculation. It's not a quick and easy process. There are, of course, other challenges that you sometimes then start to find places that don't exist anymore. Friedrich Dahl collected a lot of things from a place called Rallum in New Guinea. And when you put Rallum into GeoNames, it tells you it's in Myanmar, which is not correct, at least not the place that we're looking for. So here we have a problem that the locality we're looking for is in this case not in the database, and that makes life a little bit more complicated. So here you have to start putting on your historian's hat and start actually looking, well, what do we know about this place? And we find actually that there was a plantation in the 1900s. It's associated with some sort of World War II shipwrecks. And this allows us to start getting a kind of a handle for where this place might have been. And in this case, we actually tracked it down using weather stations. So we found a list of historical weather stations from the German Empire back in the 1900s. And we were able to find what we hope is the correct coordinates for this locality based on where there was an original weather station. And in this case, we find it's actually not just up the road from the other place we were looking at. So it kind of makes sense that this is the kind of area that Friedrich Dahl was collecting in. So you can often have to use some quite interesting and unconventional sources to try and track down individual localities. What here, and there's another critical comment, what worried me a little bit though is, are we reinventing the wheel? Because what I mean here is people like Friedrich Dahl and the many collectors in the 19th century didn't just collect spiders or their favorite animal group. They were generalist collectors. So they were collecting things, all sorts of animals from different groups from the same localities. And I have to be absolutely honest, I have no idea how far some of my colleagues are in the museum with their own databasing projects. Have they discovered this locality already? And am I, as I say, reinventing the wheel? Could I have just asked them and they could have given me the information? Or are we further on, and should we make the information that we've now discovered available to our colleagues so that they can speed up their digitization process? Because what I find is perhaps missing, at least in my institute, is coordination between collections. That you say, well, who's doing what, where. These guys often collected for multiple collections and multiple animals, and it might be useful to sort of somehow standardize these lists and try and get some sort of coordination between the curators and say, okay, this is what we have, what have you got, and try and maybe centralize that somewhere, and that might improve the whole digitization process. Other challenges, of course, places have changed their name. This is particularly a problem in Central Europe. The borders of Germany used to be much larger than before, now includes parts of Poland and France. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had everything under German names, and these were existing at the time when a lot of the collections were made, around 1900. And you've got to be a little bit careful then here. Here's a locality, Heuscheuer, and there is a Heuscheuer in Germany, in the Baden-Württemberg state, but it's not the one we're looking for. We want one in Silesia, which is now in Poland, and so we have to do a bit more searching to track down the correct current name so that we don't put the wrong locality in our database. And this is particularly in Central Europe. This can be a problem because of political changes that places have changed their names, and you have to decide, how much effort do you want to spend tracking these down, because it turns out you can go down the internet rabbit hole. Here's a locality, F. Neukrug Volyn, which we thought is probably a forestry station on the island of Volyn, which is on the Baltic Sea. And this place doesn't exist on any modern map, so we have a problem. And we started saying, well, okay, where could it be? And in the end, we found a legal document from when everything was renamed after the Second World War, that links that original German name to a current Polish name. But that's not the end of the story, because when we went to the Polish Wikipedia site, we discovered that it's an abandoned village on the edge of a forest in this part here, and we eventually tracked it down. But the problem is, when you step back, that's like a couple of hours work, maybe half an afternoon's work, just for one locality. And in the end, we sit back and say, well, actually, we were chasing the locality for a fairly common European millipede species. And was that really worth the effort? I mean, we all have limited time and resources. And so I think generally for databasing, you have to consider how much time and effort are you prepared to invest in tracking down each and every obscure locality, because it can and is sometimes quite time consuming, and the question is how complete do you want that geographical data, and how useful is that going to be for your end users? Just as an interest here, I think the artificial intelligence might offer a slightly better route. I just tried that through the AI again, and here we're getting towards the right answer. It knows that there was a place called Neukrug, that there was a forestry station somewhere on the island of Volyn, but it's still not made that link to the Polish name. So it's still not quite at the state where we can rely on it entirely to give us the modern name and modern coordinates. But perhaps in future, this might be a way to speed up this process when we can rely more on this kind of data. It's something to think about. Okay, some places, I say, are simply not in geonames at all if you're dealing with very, very small, obscure places. This is Karl Wehrhoff, who collected a huge number of millipedes and centipedes for us, and he liked collecting in the Alps, and one time he collected in this particular alpine hut, and the only way we could track it down was by physically finding that on Google Maps and then taking the coordinates directly from the Google Maps. It's simply not in any databases because the locality itself at the moment is just too small. So you might end up having to physically search for individual localities on maps themselves. This also for things like caves. This was another problem. Sometimes you had to look for specific caves in specific places, and this again had to be done from the Google Maps coordinates. Here's an interesting challenge. At some point, of course, you want to put all this data into onto your lists, and which names are you going to use? This is a beautiful country. I'm sure many of you have been there on holiday. What's its name? Most people will, of course, know it as Greece. Greekenland if you're in Germany. Its official name is the Hellenic Republic. And now we're faced with a problem. This is actually the main name that's produced from GeoNames. Which name do you want to put in your database? Do you want to put both of them in? Do you want to put in Hellenic Republic and Greece, or just one of them? Do you want to use the official name or the more unofficial name? And again here, because this name or these names have an unique ID number, one possible solution is if you've got that unique number in your database, then it doesn't really matter. You can put in either of those or link either of those in there. But at some point, you have to make a decision, which names of countries are you going to put in your geographical data? Germany, Federal Republic of Germany, up to you. But it wants to be that the point is you need to try and be consistent in your approach and not have a nasty mixture, because then when you start searching for names, you might not get all of them if you've got them under a mixture of different spellings or different names. Just an example of why this and how this can be a problem. Here's two German states. For some reason, GeoNames gave one of them, or gives one of them under the English version, Lower Saxony, and the other one under the German version, Nordrhein-Westfalen. I've no idea why they've done this. May just be a mistake in their programming, but we again have to make a decision. What's your standard language? You want to perhaps avoid having mixtures within your data. You want to say, this is what almost keeps me awake at night, is how do I keep this data internally consistent, so that it's going to be useful to search it at a later stage. And so these kinds of problems can and will turn up, and you need perhaps fairly early on in the process to decide what's your standard language. Are you going to give things in the local language, or in, as it were, the standard international language, in this case, English? And of course, a perennial problem and standard problem is places have the same name. This is Grunewald, beautiful place just on the forest on the outskirts of Berlin. I'm sure many people from the museum in the past went and collected there, and we've probably got quite a lot of material from Grunewald. The problem is, there is of course a Grunewald in the Brandenburg district around Berlin, and if the person hasn't specified I collected in the Berliner Grunewald, you can't be 100% sure which Grunewald they actually went to. And of course, something like Grunewald, green forest, is a horrible name because it occurs all over Germany and even beyond. I mean, there's even one in Namibia I see there. So the problem with these kinds of very common names is if you don't have some sort of historical context for these names, it's frankly almost impossible to resolve. You have to just put your hands up and say, we don't know. That's the name on the label. We can't say for sure which country or region these people actually collected from. And that's unfortunate, but it's a problem. People in the past weren't always as accurate in their recording of data as we would be today. So sometimes you're basically left with these very general names, and that's what we have to deal with. An interesting challenge is actually islands. We've got specimens from Sicily, and again, how do you code that into your database? You could say Sicily, and according to GeoNames, you could treat it as Sicily, an island, or you could treat it as Sicilia, the Italian state. And it's really the question, are you trying as far as possible to database things based on the political system, that you're trying to go from country to state to town and so on? Or are you going to more take a geographical thing and say, well, we'll go for the island? Because as you can see, these two alternatives actually have slightly different ID numbers and actually slightly different coordinates, because I guess the state of Sicily actually has the islands around it as well, these little tiny islands, and it means it has a slightly different coordinates. But you want to try and choose one and standardize it. What you don't want is a mixture of the state and the island going through your database. An interesting version of that, going further, is actually something like the Canary Islands, and this comes to the question of geographical hierarchies. Now, the Canary Islands are politically part of Spain, which is of course part of Europe, but geographically they're obviously much closer to Africa. So the question becomes, if you're constructing a geographical hierarchy, do you list Canary Islands as Spain and Europe, or do you list them as Africa? And it's not a completely trivial question, because if you wanted to later say, give me a list of everything you've got collected from Spain, you will get the records from the Canary Islands, which you either have to be aware that that's not going to be correct, or if you say, give me a list of everything from Africa, you won't get the data from the Canary Islands if they're in your database listed under Europe and Spain. So again, and I'm not really sure what the best solution is, but this is a problem that we've encountered and that perhaps something you maybe need to consider. Another collection problem is places that simply don't exist. As I say, we're a very old collection. Our data goes back to the 19th century, and there were places in the 19th century which now simply don't exist anymore. New Grenada, which is parts of South America and now Panama. In Central Europe, there was a region called Banat, which crosses at least 3 different countries. Or in the Baltics, people used to use terms like Courland and Livonia. Now, it was suggested to us, and I think this is a sensible suggestion, is that we just have a separate category, historical region. So we can't match those general areas to any one particular country today. And so we would just list this as a historical region and say, this is probably the best way to treat this data and not try and fix it to any one particular country. It kind of gets worse when you start getting into politically sensitive regions. Lots of places like to call themselves Macedonia. There was this big fight between Greece and North Macedonia. I'm sure we all know what's happening in the Middle East at the moment. And of course, there is the general problem of the Chinese are not convinced that Taiwan is a separate and independent state. Now, and as much as we would like as zoologists to avoid these kinds of political problems, you are still going to be forced at some point to put something in your database. You have to make a decision about how you want to categorize data which is linked to perhaps one of these names here. For things like Macedonia and Palestine, again, the historical region concept is perhaps useful. It's more neutral. It avoids you trying to make a choice between alternatives. But for something like China, Taiwan, you have to make a decision and say, well, what do you list that as under the column country? Just again, a problem that will come up and something that perhaps needs to be thought about. Now, this all is really can be quite hard work, but I think it's worth doing. When you've got that data, you can start to do interesting things with it. So we've actually just submitted a paper recently where we were looking at our millipede data. And so this is just a nice graph here. These are our 5 top collectors of millipedes in Central Europe. And with all this data, you can now do a lovely map of who collected what where and get an idea where individuals had their collecting focus points, or where we as a museum have our main focus, which countries have we collected very extensively from, where less so. So you can see we're kind of down the middle and into the Alps. We've got a lot around in the north of Germany as well. And this just is a nice way to visualize the data for our external users, that they can say, okay, that's what you've got here in Berlin. And that's great. That's kind of our goal, and that's what we're trying long term to do. But I must emphasize that tracking down these sometimes obscure historical localities is and can be hard work. And interestingly, it's not really part of a usual biologist training. I mean, I'm kind of, as a hobby, interested in history, but that's still not what I'm really trained to do. And I've actually ended up having to learn a lot about Central European history, just finding all these Polish localities that used to be under German names. So someone has to do that. And I mean, you either get someone in externally and say, okay, we're bringing a dedicated geographer to do that work, or you need someone on your team who's prepared to make that effort to do this kind of aspect of the database. Okay, the final one then is the who collected it. Again, just a quick focus on Friedrich Dahl as one of our most important collectors, not just in New Guinea, but also in Europe as well. And we've been encouraged to use what are called Wikidata Q numbers. And if you're not familiar with those, Wikidata is a bit like Wikipedia. And what it is, and what it does is it assigns so-called Q numbers, again, unique ID numbers, to people, places, objects, and so on. But we're most interested here in the people. And so everyone who's kind of considered significant enough in public life is given their own unique Q number. And the nice thing about Q numbers is that it basically just links to a huge list of everything known about that person. Different ways that they spelt their name, where they worked, where they were perhaps active as collectors, what they did. And so here we've got all the data known about and all the links about Friedrich Dahl. And because it's wiki-based, this could always be updated and improved in the future. You could do it yourself. If you discover something about this collector, you can add that information into there to improve the data for everyone. That's of course, very nice. An alternative, at least in Germany, that we've sometimes used is the German National Library. It's a bit more focused on what people published or wrote, but it also does the same kind of thing. It gives them a unique number, all the versions of their names, and gives you the sort of even basic information about it. So as an alternative to the Q number, you could use something like the German National Database Library database number. And this is also something you could stick in your database if you really want to. And it just means you can track down collectors quite quickly and easily. I mean, not everyone has their own Q number. Some collectors are too obscure, but where you've got them, I think it's useful to include them. And in fact, what we've tried to do is come up with like a big long list of all our known collectors. And I've tried to organize this by a kind of hierarchy of certainty. So in green are people where we're pretty much sure we know who we've got. In yellow are people where we kind of suspect that's who it is. And in red are the ones where we don't know. We've simply got a name and a locality. And at the moment, at least, nothing else. And just to give you a couple of examples of what I mean by that, here's an entry from our database, a millipede collected in Italy by someone called Bergso in the 1860s. Now, we track that down to someone who we're fairly sure it's Jorgen Wilhelm Bergso, because we know from other data that he was a writer, a poet, but also a trained entomologist. His life date fits that collecting date, so it's not too late or too early. We know from work that he published on centipedes, so it's quite likely that he collected in the same area that you'd find a millipede. That's kind of becoming similar habitats. And we also have a historical context here that we know he was in Italy in the 1860s. And so when you put all of that together, I think and hope that we can be fairly confident that the Bergso there in that database is this Bergso here, and we can then link into his Wikidata name and so on. So that will be an example of where everything's worked. One where we're not completely sure would be this one here. This is, again, it's a centipede collected in South Africa by someone called Boyster, and it's probably this Carl Friedrich Boyster. Here we know he was a missionary, so missionaries, of course, often went to Africa. We have his life dates, but we don't have a collecting date, so we can't be sure that that's in the right sort of time. But I mean, it's kind of an old historical collection. It's likely to be from the 19th century. What we don't know is whether he was in any way interested in these kinds of animals. We don't know if he had a particular link to the museum, that he said his best friend worked in the museum and he sent all of his animals that he collected to Berlin. That we're not sure, but the locality looks pretty good. So Shivhasi sounds very much like the same place, just spelt in a different way. So here you can perhaps be 90% sure that we've got the right person, but we're just missing that last bit of proof that will make that, make him a green category person. And finally, yeah, these are the problem ones. And I mean, at some point again, you just have to say, sorry, guys, that's all we know. So we know there's someone called Bance. He was a doctor, so he was educated, but we don't have any dates for him at the moment. We don't know what animals he was interested in or what he collected. We have a locality, Puerto Cabello, probably in Venezuela, but it's one of those names that perhaps it's used quite often, and so we can't be 100% sure where he collected, and so there's nothing really more that we can say at the moment. Perhaps in future we'll get some additional information and track him down a bit further, but at the moment that's all we know, and so that's the situation we're in. Now, I think this kind of thing is sometimes worth doing because you can sometimes come up with really nice stories, and these are none, the things we have like long night at the museums, and you can kind of, come up with interesting, funny stories for the public. So we know, for example, that we had specimens collected by Adalbert von Chamisso, who was perhaps much more famous as a poet and writer, but he was actually a naturalist as well, and collected in the South Seas, and his material came to the museum. Bizarrely, we got some specimens collected by the second president of Liberia. Whether he collected them himself, I don't know, but that's kind of an interesting story. And remarkably, we had a millipede collected by Boris III, the Tsar of Bulgaria, and it's very clear from the literature that it was him who did it, and we've got the specimen. So these are the kind of stories that are very interesting and nice because you can track down these collectors. However, you might not like what you find, particularly once you start going into colonial contexts. You will, particularly in the former German colonies, you will come across people who have behaved very, very badly. And we're talking violence, sexual violence, and then people who have really committed atrocities. And you have to be aware of how you're going to deal with that. I mean, they are the collectors, they need to go into the database, but you have to be sensitive that some people will have collected under circumstances which today are seen as quite reprehensible. So again, we actually have people in the museum. We have a whole teams who are trying to look at our colonial context and then how this data and how this material actually came to be in the museum. Okay, but again, chasing down these curators can be time consuming, and it's not typical work for a biologist. So just to start to summarize, this is where we are so far. With the sea spiders and the myriapods, we pretty much got the names, we've got the collectors, we've got the localities. We just need to do the final checks of what we have. With the spiders, we've done the name check. I've pretty much finished that, but we still have to do the collectors and the georeferencing. That's going to take probably the rest of my career, I guess, tracking all those 50,000 entries down. But, progress is being made. And so my conclusions are that this transcription of the raw data, I think, is relatively straightforward. And so we use now volunteers to do that, and they do a great job. That's really, really helpful. They give us that data in a sort of basic format. Correcting that data is often much harder and can be very time consuming if you want to get it into that sort of condition that it's really accurate data that you can put into a final database. Don't underestimate the value of having people doing it who really know the animal groups. It makes it much, much easier, particularly when it comes to correcting names and the taxonomy of the groups. It's really helpful to have someone who knows what they're doing. And you will be aware that you may need familiarity with geography and history, which is not part of your usual biological training. And I think I've talked for too long now, so I'll say thank you very much. Thank you for listening, and lots of success in your own projects.